Hey everyone, tonight we embark on a journey that takes us deep into the heart of West Africa, to a place where history's usual rules were rewritten in blood and iron. We are going back to the Kingdom of Dahomey, specifically the 18th and 19th centuries, a period of brutal efficiency and breathtaking military spectacle. I want you to close your eyes if you can, and picture the oppressive timidity of the tropical scrubland, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke, sweat, and the coppery temps of recent sacrifice. You are approaching the capital city of Abomey. The mud walls rise surprisingly high, and the sheer scale of the operation, the market chatter, the constant movement of enslaved people being marched toward the coast, the sound of drums echoing from the royal compound tells you this is a state built on singular, terrifying economic footing. This is a kingdom that didn't just participate in the Atlantic slave trade. It was a factory floor for it. You notice the deep drainage ditches near the gates, and you quickly realize they are not for water. They are to channel the blood from the annual human sacrifice rituals, known chillingly as the annual customs, which replenished the ancestors' strength and terrified every neighbor. Now imagine walking through the royal Agojie palace compound, a sprawling complex of clay and thatch. You expect to see the king's personal guardmen, naturally standing rigid with their muskets. Instead, your breath catches. Standing guard are women. They are physically imposing, meticulously clean, and their eyes hold an intense, unsettling focus. They wear short, sleeveless tunics, often blue or white, and carry their weapons with an unnerving confidence. This is not just a novelty. This is the core military power of the Kingdom of Dahomey. They are known today as the Dahomey Amazons, but to their people, they were the Nanana Matano or mothers. Their existence, their skill, and their ruthlessness turned the conventional military map of the region upside down. This kingdom, which you are now standing in, was founded around 1625, but its ascent to regional superpower status wasn't achieved through diplomacy. It was achieved through relentless military expansion. The early kings, such as Agojie, solidified the kingdom's borders by brutally subjugating the surrounding small states. Dahomey's geography was poor for agriculture, lacking navigable rivers and possessing thin soil. But it had one immense advantage: proximity to the coast, meaning it could act as the middleman for the European slave ships. Its entire political and military architecture was geared towards one purpose: constant warfare to secure captives. Historians still argue whether the economic dependence on the slave trade fostered the creation of the female corps, or if the corps' effectiveness cemented that reliance. What is undeniable is that Dahomey's wealth, its imported luxury goods, and its stability were paid for in human lives, collected by an army unlike any other. You probably wouldn't survive this city for long if you were anyone other than a respected trader or a high-lip-list official. Given the constant suspicion and the state's absolute control over life and death, you feel a shiver, realizing that the gentle breeze you felt might not be the wind, but the movement of one of these silent warriors standing unseen nearby. The initial seeds of this remarkable female force were planted, perhaps inadvertently, by the early kings, specifically King Agojie, who ruled from around 1645 to 1685. In those early years, the kingdom needed to hunt for food, leading to the formation of a special hunter corps called the Guerrilla. These were not soldiers. They were highly skilled trackers and providers. But in the hierarchical and often gender-fluid context of the Dahomey court, these women who dared to enter the traditional male space of the hunt gained a unique position and respect. The very fact that a woman could publicly wield a musket and a machete, skills reserved for men almost everywhere else in the world at that time, marked Dahomey as a powerful outlier. You realize that in many ways, the king was building a society where gender roles were secondary to military utility and state power. The story of the Nenomitan is not just about fierce fighting women. It's about a state that was so pragmatic and so obsessed with conquest and survival that it harnessed every ounce of human potential, regardless of sex. It was a terrifying efficiency that Western observers, blinded by their own societal norms, struggled to categorize, often defaulting to exoticizing the force rather than analyzing its strategic brilliance. That confusion, as we will see, was one of the warrior's greatest weapons. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where are you tuning in from? What's the local time where you are? Drop a comment below. Now dim the lights, Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The drums are getting louder, and the Nananmatan are stirring. You are still standing within the massive royal compound in Dahomey, and your focus shifts entirely to the women in uniform. Remember the early hunter corps, the Gebeto that we just mentioned. They are the genesis point, the small seed that grew into this massive, terrifying military tree. The transition wasn't instantaneous. It was a slow, calculated move by the monarchy to secure absolute loyalty and a distinct advantage. King Agojie, who is responsible for the early organizational structure of Dahomey, realized the profound utility of having a personal guard whose loyalties were singular and whose dedication was absolute. He observed the prowess of the Gebeto, these women who could track game for days and demonstrate incredible endurance, and decided to bring them closer to the throne. This was the moment the Hunter Corps began its transformation into an elite palace guard. Why women? Because they represented a resource that could be isolated, managed, and indoctrinated in a way that male soldiers who had existing clan loyalties, families, and business interests could not. Imagine the palace in the late 17th century. The king's male guards were often drawn from powerful lineages, meaning their allegiance was sometimes split between the throne and their family's ambitions. But these early female guards, often recruited from war captives, orphans, or women dedicated to the palace life, were intentionally removed from the conventional Dahomeyan social structure. Their entire identity, status, and material well-being became intrinsically linked to the king. They were the king's wives, or Agojie term that was often symbolic rather than strictly matrimonial, signifying their complete devotion to the monarch. They were his hands and his eyes, unbound by the politics of the male nobility. This isolation was deliberate, a key part of the psychological structuring of the force. You realize that to become one of the Agojie meant ascending to a status far above the ordinary woman in Dahomey, but it also meant abandoning any hope of a traditional life. They were considered married to the spirit of the king, which gave them unique privileges, including the right to pass through any gate or checkpoint in the kingdom without challenge, but it also demanded complete celibacy and a dedication that bordered on religious fervor. The first major deployment of these palace women, as actual fighting soldiers rather than just ceremonial guards, is credited by some accounts to King Agojie in the early 18th century. Agojie needed soldiers and fast. Legend has it that he initially used women to fill gaps in the defenses when the men were away fighting or when the kingdom faced a sudden, desperate siege. He was impressed by their ferocity and discipline. The women fought not just to defend the capital, but with a palpable rage and dedication that sometimes exceeded their male counterparts. They had everything to lose. If the kingdom fell, their elevated status vanished. They would revert to being ordinary women, or worse, slaves. This transformation also solved a quirk of Dahomeyan politics, because the king's wives were separated and had their own quarters and structure. Utilizing them as a fighting force kept them within a controlled, insulated environment. You can see the logic. Create an army that is utterly loyal, resides within the palace walls, and reports only to you. It was a masterstroke of political engineering disguised as military innovation. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this era is the debate over the initial criteria for recruitment. While later, under Gezo, the recruiting became more systematic in these early days. There are records suggesting that the height and physical strength of the women were less important than their mental resilience, and crucially, their skill with a knife. They were initially prized for their ability to silently execute high-value targets or conduct swift raids, rather than engaging in massed formation combat. Their early role was arguably closer to special forces than to infantry. When you look at the structure forming now, you see that the women had their own distinct chains of command and titles, mirroring the male army but operating separately. This dual system ensured that no single group, male or female, could become too powerful, a clever political balancing act. Historians still argue whether King Agojie's reliance on the female corps in the 1720s was a sign of desperate necessity following a defeat, or an intentional, early experiment in social engineering to consolidate royal power. Regardless of the precise motive, the result was the same: the establishment of the Agojie as an irreversible fact of Dahomeyan life. They were given the best equipment, initially spears, and those brutal, oversized machetes, and intensive training. They learned to move as one, their steps silent in the dust. You hear the rhythmic thud-thud of their drill now, a sound that would soon carry terror across the entire region. This wasn't just a military unit, it was a state institution, growing ever stronger, waiting for the king who would fully unleash its power. That king, as you will see, was Gezo. The momentum is building in Abomey. The foundation of the elite female guard has been laid by King Agojie and perhaps tested by King Agojie, but it is under King Gezo, who reigned from 1818 to 1858, that the Agojie transformed from a palace guard into the sprawling, fearsome fighting machine of legend. Gezo was a pragmatist and a reformer, realizing that the kingdom's survival hinged on two things: dominating the slave trade and having a military that was utterly unmatched. You see Gezo now, standing tall, his eyes keenly observing a parade ground exercise. He recognizes that Dahomey has a critical weakness. Its population is small compared to its rivals, particularly the massive Yoruba city-state of Abeokuta, which we will visit soon. The kingdom simply couldn't afford the continuous high casualty rates that warfare demanded, using only male soldiers. Every male loss represented a lost farmer, a lost artisan, a lost father. But the female corps, they were isolated, dedicated, and their expansion solved multiple social and military problems at once. Gezo dramatically scaled up the female military corps, increasing their numbers from perhaps a few hundred ceremonial guards to a standardized, highly disciplined force numbering between 4,000 and 6,000. Women sometimes up to a third of the entire Dahameyan army. This expansion was systematic and ruthless. He formalized the recruitment process, relying on three main sources, and you can sense the tension in the air as the recruitment teams go out. Volunteers, some women, were genuinely drawn to the prestige, the wealth, and the power that came with being an Agojie. They enjoyed a status far above civilian women, lived in the royal palace, and possessed servants. Family submissions, crucially, many girls, some as young as 8 or 10, were given over to the army by their fathers. A father might present a daughter if she was deemed too unruly, rebellious, or perhaps just too strong-willed for a conventional marriage. For these fathers, it was a way of disposing of a difficult child while also demonstrating profound loyalty to the king. It was a bizarre kind of social engineering where society's misfits were channeled into its most elite, useful arm. War captives, a significant portion of the army, was continually replenished by captured women from enemy states, particularly the region around Abeokuta. They were given a choice: serve the king and gain status, or become enslaved and possibly sacrificed. For many, the choice to become a warrior was simply a bid for survival and power in a brutal world. The military goal of this expansion was clear: to secure dominance. Dahomey's primary income came from selling slaves. Their economic rivals were the nearby Oyo Empire and, increasingly, Abeokuta. Gezo needed a tool that was both politically reliable and devastatingly effective on the battlefield. By increasing the female corps, he was creating a dedicated, non-clan-based military machine focused purely on the interests of the king and the state's revenue stream. You watch as the newly recruited girls are brought into the compound. Their faces are a mixture of confusion and fear, but there is also a nascent spark of defiance. Their indoctrination is immediate. They are stripped of their civilian identity and given new names. They learn that they are not just soldiers. They are virgins consecrated to the war god, Go. This religious framing was essential, turning their military duty into a holy calling. The expansion also coincided with Gezo's economic shift. While the slave trade remained the core revenue, Gezo began pushing for more domestic palm oil production in the mid-19th century as European Luzesto's abolition efforts intensified. However, he quickly realized that the constant need for labor and, more importantly, the necessity of maintaining the prestige of Dahomey as a powerful state required continuous warfare to secure tribute and captives. The expanded female army was the perfect instrument for this delicate balancing act between commerce and conquest. A quirky tidbit that demonstrates Gezo's commitment to his female force is the fact that he deliberately commissioned European visitors and chroniclers to witness the warriors' exercises. He understood the power of propaganda. He wanted the British, the French, and the Portuguese to see these terrifying professional women soldiers and carry the tales of their ferocity back to Europe. It enhanced his reputation and intimidated his enemies. He was one of the world's first kings to grasp the power of strategic PR. Historians still argue whether the rapid expansion under Gezo was primarily an act of political self-preservation to bypass his powerful male chiefs. or purely a logistical response to the manpower shortage caused by continuous resource-intensive warfare. What is certain is that by the end of his reign, the Agojie were divided into several distinct regiments: the musketeers, the backbone of the army, the razor women wielding massive, cruel, razor-edged machetes for close combat and decapitation, and the archers who were phased out as firearms became more available. The stage was set for their legendary, terrifying role on the battlefield. The raw recruits, whether orphaned, surrendered by a parent, or captured, now faced the grim reality of life as a warrior. You are now standing on the training grounds just outside the palace walls, watching a scene of almost unbelievable physical and psychological conditioning. This wasn't merely boot camp, it was a total reshaping of the human being, designed to forge absolute endurance and complete disregard for fear, pain, or death. The physical training was brutal. Remember that the Dahomey terrain is not forgiving. It's hot, humid, and full of dense scrub and unforgiving insects. The warriors were trained to cover vast distances at a run. You can see them now jogging for hours under the relentless West African sun. Carrying heavy packs containing their standard issue equipment, they trained relentlessly with their weapons, the musket, which we will detail later, and their terrifyingly large machetes, often personalized with intricate etchings. Mastery of the machete was crucial for the close-quarters fighting in the dense bush, where a musket was useless until loaded. A core element of their training was the exercise in navigating the thorn-covered acacia scrub. Recruits were deliberately sent into thickets of thorny bushes, wearing nothing but their thin tunics, forced to crawl, run, and hide. The goal was twofold. First, to become physically hardened against cuts and scrapes, making them oblivious to minor injuries that would stop a conventional soldier. And second, to master silent movement through the bush. They learned to move so quietly that a European observer later remarked they could pass through grass without bending a blade. You wince as a recruit emerges, her legs covered in bleeding scratches, but her face is set, devoid of complaint. The psychological conditioning was perhaps even more effective. Recruits were systematically desensitized to violence and death. They were forced to witness and participate in executions, particularly during the annual customs. The official narrative was that they were learning the smell of war. Early in their training, they would be tasked with executing condemned war captives, often by decapitation, using the very machete they would carry into battle. This was a critical rite of passage. It shattered any residual civilian morality, ensuring that the recruit viewed the enemy not as a person, but as a military objective to be neutralized. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the recorded test of nerve involving a live calf. In one notorious training exercise, new recruits were told to plunge into a pen of nervous, panicking calves and swiftly execute one using only their bare hands, or a small knife, sometimes having to bite out a specific organ to prove their grit. This wasn't about efficiency. It was about demonstrating a total lack of squeamishness and a readiness to commit acts of extreme sudden violence. The ultimate goal was the creation of a unit that fought with cold professional ferocity. The warriors were indoctrinated to believe that surrender was not an option. Being captured meant dishonor to the king and the ancestors. This zero-tolerance approach to failure, coupled with the immense prestige and power they held within the kingdom, generated an almost fanatical zeal on the battlefield. You realize that their privileged status was entirely conditional upon their performance in combat. The concept of fear was actively dismantled. When they were out on campaign, they were often deprived of adequate food and water, not as punishment, but to teach them to fight effectively while suffering. They learned that the pain of an empty stomach or a parched throat was secondary to the mission. This training and privation proved incredibly effective against European forces who were reliant on sophisticated supply chains. When a European soldier stopped to rest and resupply, the Dahomey warrior kept moving, fueled by a mixture of discipline and sheer hardened will. Historians still argue whether the high levels of attrition during the initial training phase were an intentional part of the state's eugenics, or merely an unavoidable consequence of the physical demands of the training regimen. What is clear is that those who survived emerged as an elite force, physically and mentally superior to nearly any contemporary army in West Africa. This rigorous training culminated in the most famous of their initiation rituals, which we are about to witness, the descent into the terrifying crocodile pit. You are no longer just observing the grueling training regimen. You are now standing on the precipice of the final, most terrifying act of initiation. This is the moment where the psychological conditioning of endurance and disregard we discussed earlier is tested to its absolute limit. The infamous ceremony of the crocodile pit. This ritual was designed not only to prove bravery, but to finalize the recruit's death to her former life and complete submission to the king and the war god, Go. The setting is always dramatic. Picture a large, dusty arena near the royal compound. A vast crowd, including the male military chiefs, high-ranking dignitaries, and the chillingly silent Agojie veterans, gathers. The air is thick with anticipation, and the rhythmic drumming is now a frantic heartbeat, pushing the nervous energy to a peak. In the center of the arena lies the focus of the horror, a deep, dry pit. Now, here is the crucial detail that often gets sensationalized in popular history. The nature of the pit itself. When European chroniclers first reported this, they often spoke of live crocodiles. While this makes for great, horrifying copy, modern scholarly review suggests the reality was often a calculated psychological torture, more terrifying than a clean death. The pit was more frequently filled with a truly agonizing mixture, the sharp, broken shards of pottery, often glass if available from trade, and most importantly, dense, thorny brush, specifically the type of sharp, cruel acacia they trained in. The pit became a symbol of the impossibility of retreat. The recruit stands on the edge, maybe 15 or 20 feet above this churning bed of pain, and she is given her final command: leap or face instant, brutal execution by the veterans waiting behind her. You watch as a young recruit approaches the edge. Her eyes are wide, but her body language suggests a practiced, rigid control. She knows that failing to jump is not an option. The choice isn't between safety and pain. It's between excruciating pain followed by glory or instant anonymous death as a coward. This ritual perfectly encapsulated the Agojie philosophy. Embrace the suffering, discard the fear. She leaps. The crowd lets out a collective gasp. There is the sickening sound of her body hitting the bottom, followed by a moment of utter silence. Then the inevitable scramble as she forces herself to climb out, using small handholds cut into the mud walls. She emerges, bleeding, cut, and perhaps seriously injured, but she is transformed. She is alive, and she has faced the pit. A quirkier tidbit is the historical account of the Agojie being paraded through the town immediately after surviving the pit. They were still covered in dust and blood, but they were given a drink of palm wine and a new set of immaculate, clean military clothing. The message was clear. You have shed your weak civilian self. You are now reborn as a warrior of the king, unblemished by your past. This public display was essential, serving as recruitment propaganda for the kingdom's citizens and psychological warfare against its enemies. The pit was essentially a formalized, irreversible psychological break. It forced the recruit to engage in an extreme act of self-reliance and commitment. Once you have willingly thrown yourself into a pit of thorns and glass, what enemy soldier can truly frighten you? You have demonstrated a disregard for your own body that few male soldiers anywhere in the world could match. Historians still argue whether the reports of the pit being occasionally filled with water and live starved crocodiles were pure exaggeration by nervous European visitors, or if this ultimate lethal test was reserved for a select small number of recruits entering the most elite regiment, perhaps the king's personal bodyguards. What is certain is that the myth of the pit, whether dry or wet, was one of Dahomey's most potent psychological weapons, amplifying the warrior's reputation for suicidal bravery. As the recruit is carried away to be cleaned and patched up, she is no longer a girl. She is a non-Mitin. Her training is complete, her commitment absolute, and her fear has been systematically annihilated. She is now ready to receive her standard issue uniform and, more importantly, her weapons, which were surprisingly modern for the time. Having survived the terror of the pit, remember the shards and thorns, the newly forged non-Mitin now moves to the armory, an act that solidifies her status and defines her role on the battlefield. You are standing in the weapon yard, taking in the unique combination of traditional West African implements and surprisingly modern European firearms. Her uniform, weapons, and distinctiveness were carefully designed not just for function, but for maximum psychological effect. The uniform itself was deceptively simple, but highly functional. The typical attire consisted of a short, sleeveless tunic, often dyed blue or sometimes white, for specific regiments, made of coarse cotton. Underneath, They wore knee-length trousers, providing protection in the thorny bush. A key feature was the sash, often a bright red, worn around the waist. This color choice was intentional, symbolizing the blood they were prepared to shed, and more practically, distinguishing them instantly from the general populace and often their male counterparts on the battlefield. However, the equipment was what truly set them apart. Their standard armament included two primary instruments of warfare, reflecting the dual nature of Dahomey's tactics long-range discipline and brutal close-quarters chaos. The musket, the backbone of their firepower, was the imported European musket. Dahomey, through its deep involvement in the slave trade, had the economic means to acquire a steady supply of firearms. The muskets were primarily Danish-made flintlock rifles, acquired via the trade ports. These were single-shot muzzle-loading weapons, which required a laborious process of pouring powder, seeding a ball, and priming the pan before each shot. The machete, or razor. This was their signature close combat weapon, often depicted as a razor-like implement. While the term razor women often referred to the executioners, the gulahento, every warrior was a master of the machete. Theirs were often heavy, wide-bladed tools designed for hacking through the dense undergrowth and lethally for decapitation. The psychological impact of seeing a warrior charge toward you wielding one of these terrifying blades was immense. You watch as a young warrior is handed her musket and her pouch of powder and balls. The training in loading and firing these temperamental weapons was intense. They were taught to load with speed and precision, maintaining a disciplined volley fire that could devastate an advancing enemy. In European armies, the rate of fire was notoriously slow. The Dahomey warriors drilled until they could achieve a respectable rate under pressure. Their distinctiveness extended beyond the battlefield. They wore amulets and charms, called bow or grigoris, often incorporated into their headgear or tunics, believed to offer spiritual protection. This blend of European technology and indigenous spiritual practices made them seem both modern and terrifyingly alien to Western observers. A quirky tidbit that reveals their practical side. During long campaigns, their marching order was highly specialized. They had designated women carrying massive water gourds and others carrying provisions. But they also had women specialized in carrying ammunition and powder in waterproof containers, demonstrating a level of logistical planning that sometimes surpassed their male counterparts. They were a self-contained mobile military unit. The use of the machete in their arsenal also underscores their primary role in Dahomey's economy of war, securing captives, while the musket was used to break the enemy line. The closane fighting with the machete was often the stage for taking prisoners. A clean, quick strike could subdue an enemy without necessarily killing them, ensuring a valuable captive for the slave trade or for future sacrifice. Historians still argue whether the Agojie primarily fought in disciplined European-style formations, firing volleys, or favored highly fluid shock tactic charges with their machetes. The evidence suggests a practical blend: musket fire to create disorder, followed by a terrifying, silent, and swift charge with blades to exploit the resulting confusion. This mixture of discipline and ferocity was incredibly difficult for their regional rivals to handle. You observe the new warrior strapping on her accoutrements. The weight of the weapon, the feel of the cool steel, and the heavy leather of the bandolier transform her posture. She is no longer just a recruit. She is now a lethal instrument of state policy, ready to step into the elevated social status that comes with wearing the king's uniform. The transformation is complete, and the newly uniformed warrior now enters a world of profound privilege and paradox. You step inside the confines of the royal palace, the designated residence for the Agojie. Here, you witness the intricate social contract that defined their existence: tremendous social status and warrior perks in exchange for absolute dedication and the renunciation of conventional life. To be one of the king's wives, or Agojie, meant instant elevation. They were the most celebrated figures in Dahomey society, second only to the royal family. Imagine the psychological impact. A woman, who perhaps was considered unruly or was a captured enemy, now commanded instant deference from male civilians, male soldiers, and even many of the male chiefs. This status was cemented by the material benefits they enjoyed. They were housed in dedicated, extensive quarters within the palace walls. Unlike ordinary citizens, they were supplied with better food, clothing, and access to luxury goods imported through the very slave trade they helped maintain. Crucially, they were granted servants, dozens of them, usually young enslaved men, to cater to their every need. You can see one of the warriors now simply snapping her fingers, and a male servant rushes to adjust her sash or bring her water. This reversal of gender roles in servitude was a powerful, visible reminder of their supreme status. The most striking aspect of their privilege was the cultural taboo that surrounded them. When Agojie moved outside the palace, she was preceded by a slave ringing a small bell. Upon hearing this bell, any man in the vicinity, regardless of his own rank, was required to stop, turn away, and avert his gaze. To look upon one of the king's wives was considered an act of disrespect to the king himself, punishable by death. You feel a distinct chill when you hear that bell, knowing you must instantly pivot and look down. This extreme separation from men was key to maintaining their dedication. They were, in effect, placed outside the jurisdiction of traditional society. They could not marry, bear children, their celibacy was strictly enforced, or own personal property that was not ultimately tied to the king. Their allegiance was purely to the state. Any relationship or pregnancy would result in immediate, severe punishment, usually death, as it represented a betrayal of their sacred vows to the war god, Go, and the king. A quirky tidbit that highlights their internal structure is their role in policing the general population. Because they were effectively beyond the social norms applied to men, they were occasionally deployed as internal police or enforcers, particularly in matters of tax collection or suppressing dissent. A male official might hesitate to confront a powerful chief's wife, but an Agojie could operate without that fear of familial or political reprisal, making them excellent agents of royal authority. Their role was also heavily integrated into the religious and ceremonial life of Dahomey. They participated prominently in the annual customs, where they would proudly display the heads of defeated enemies, celebrating the kingdom's martial might. They were not just soldiers, they were sacred symbols of Dahomey's strength. Historians still argue whether the celibacy rule was strictly enforced for political reasons, to prevent powerful warrior lineages from forming, or if it was rooted in the deeply religious belief that their power came from their ritual dedication to the masculine principles of war, requiring them to remain ritually pure and unencumbered by the domestic sphere. What is certain is that this unique social status gave them unparalleled psychological leverage over their enemies. They were fighting forces who had already relinquished everything personal. You see the older, battle-hardened veterans within the barracks. They carry themselves with an air of quiet, lethal confidence. They have earned the respect that the bell commands. They are the living proof that in Dahomey military utility trumped gender norms, creating a societal anomaly that fascinated and terrified the world simultaneously. They are ready now to be organized into the formal, professional military structure that will lead them to war. The fierce independence and high status of the Agojie needed structure to be effective on the battlefield. You are now looking at a complex organizational chart, a blueprint for war that reveals the strategic brilliance of the Dahomeyan monarchy. The all-male command structure. This organization was intentionally designed as a parallel mirror to the male army, ensuring functional separation and preventing any internal power struggles from destabilizing the realm. The female army was rigidly organized into regiments, each specializing in different aspects of combat, just like their male counterparts. These regiments were headed by high-ranking female officers with specialized, often ceremonial, titles. At the very top of the female military hierarchy was a supreme commander, often given the title Akbadem or a similar designation, who was the female counterpart to the male army's commander-in-chief. Beneath this supreme commander, the army was usually divided into wings or flanks, the right wing, the left wing, and the center. Each of these wings was led by a woman general. You realize the profound political statement this made. Women were not simply integrated into a male structure. They had their own complete independent military hierarchy right up to the top echelons of generalship. A crucial aspect of this system was the internal communication within the palace. The female generals reported directly to the king, bypassing the male military chiefs on issues concerning the female corps' readiness, strategy, and deployment. This direct, insulated line of command ensured that the king always had a powerful, loyal, and informed military asset that could not be politically manipulated by the male nobility. This direct access to the king amplified their political power considerably. You watch an exercise where the officers are drilling their units, The soldiers are divided primarily by their weapon specialization. Reflecting the needs of the time, musketeers Gabetto, the largest group, the infantry backbone, specialized in coordinated volleys of flintlock fire. Reapers, cutlasses Gulahento, the razor women, specializing in the massive machetes utilized for close combat, swift ambushes, and often battlefield executions and decapitations. Hunters Gabetto, a term sometimes used broadly. These women specialized in tracking, scouting, and reconnaissance, using their earlier hunting skills to perfection. Archers, while less common after the widespread acquisition of firearms, a small contingent remained, primarily for specialized silent engagements or support roles. A quirky tidbit that demonstrates the importance of status and rivalry is the intense competition between the female regiments during parades and military reviews before the king. Regiments would compete fiercely to demonstrate the highest level of drill precision, the most terrifying war chants, and the most impressive displays of ferocity. This internal competition was a deliberate tool used by the king to drive up the overall performance of the army. This internal structure also provided clear avenues for promotion. A young recruit knew that bravery in battle, exceptional discipline, and unwavering loyalty could lead her up the ranks, earning her greater prestige, more servants, and closer proximity to the king. The female corps offered a clear meritocracy in a society often bound by birthright. Historians still argue whether the female command structure was truly autonomous on the battlefield, or if the male army's generals held ultimate overarching tactical control during major campaigns. Most evidence suggests that while the overall strategy was dictated by the king and his male council, the Migan and Mu, the female generals had complete autonomy over the tactical deployment, internal discipline, and execution of maneuvers for their specific corps once the battle commenced. They were trusted to deliver. You feel the weight of this organization. It is not an ad hoc grouping of warriors. It is a meticulously planned, highly professional standing army. Its efficiency, dedication, and structure are about to be tested as the Kingdom of Dahomey turns its attention toward its neighbors, looking for tribute, captives, and continued dominance over the slave coast. The rigorous training and intricate command structure are now irrelevant until they are proven in the crucible of combat. You are now tracking the Dahomey army as they march out from Abumi, no longer merely training, but conducting full-scale battles of conquest and tribute. For the Nananmitan, the early 19th century was a period of constant, active campaigning, primarily directed against the neighboring states that either resisted Dahomey's increasing dominance or served as rich hunting grounds for captives. The primary targets were the various factions of the Yoruba people to the east, and the states along the coast, particularly the area around the ports. The Kingdom of Dahomey's motto might as well have been, "If you don't fight, you don't eat." The state economy relied on the consistent flow of war, captives sold into the transatlantic slave trade, and the collection of annual tribute from subjugated territories. This constant campaigning was the engine that drove the state. Imagine the march now. The warriors are silent, moving in long, disciplined lines through the dense bush. The Agojie often served as the vanguard or the shock troops, deployed to break the initial enemy resistance due to their reputation and ferocity. Their tactics were not always about pitched battle. They were masters of the lightning raid. You are witnessing a typical Nananmitan raid on an enemy town. The army moves rapidly, covering huge distances in silence, sometimes marching for 3 to 4 days on minimal rations. The goal is surprise. They usually attack just before dawn, when the town is asleep and the fog is thickest. The war drums and horns only sound after the initial breach of the perimeter, turning the shock into sheer panic. The warrior women would burst through the defenses, utilizing their machetes in close quarters to quickly neutralize the men capable of fighting, while simultaneously moving to secure women and children, the most valuable captives. They were ruthless in their efficiency. Unlike their male counterparts who sometimes focused on looting, the Agojie were primarily focused on the mission, capturing and securing the maximum number of people. A quirky tidbit that reveals their military discipline is their treatment of war booty. Whereas male soldiers often squabbled over personal spoils, the Nananmitan, as agents of the king, were trained to immediately deliver all captives and valuables to their female officers, who would then hand them over to the royal authorities. This ensured that the king and the state retained absolute control over the spoils of war, reinforcing their unique loyalty. These early battles solidified their fearsome reputation. In many areas, the mere rumor that the king's wives were marching was enough to cause mass panic and flight. The neighboring peoples knew that the Nanomitten fought with a singular intensity. They rarely took prisoners among the male defenders, and their goal was total subjugation. This psychological factor was an invaluable asset to Dahomey. The campaigns against the Yoruba in the 1820s and 1830s were particularly important. Dahomey was fighting to free itself from the historical vassalage to the remnants of the powerful Oyo Empire. By successfully raiding and conquering Yoruba towns, the Agojie proved their worth, demonstrating that they were not just a ceremonial guard, but the decisive factor in Dahomey's push for regional hegemony. Historians still argue whether the success of the Agojie in these early conquests was due more to their superior weaponry, the steady supply of Danish muskets, or their superior organization, training, and the sheer terror they inspired. It was likely a combination. The musket fire broke the lines, and the terror of the machete charge secured the victory. The ultimate objective of these victories was the capital, Abomey. The captive population was marched back, often in chains, to fill the markets for the European traders waiting at the coast, and to provide victims for the annual customs. You realize that every victory the Agojie achieved translated directly into state revenue and the continued brutal prosperity of Dahomey. However, their ultimate test of strength would not be against a small town, but against the massive, heavily fortified rival city of Abeokuta. The series of successful raids we just witnessed were mere skirmishes compared to the military objective that dominated King Gezo's mid-19th century strategy, the destruction of Abeokuta. This massive, fortified city was not just a rival for regional power, it was a sanctuary for people resisting the slave trade and a major obstacle to Dahomey's economic machine. You are now positioned for the most ambitious and ultimately devastating assaults of the Agojie Abeokuta. The capital of the Egba Yoruba was known as the Under-the-Rock Settlement, built into and around giant granite outcrops. Its defenses were legendary. Instead of simple stockades, it was protected by concentric rings of massive deep trenches and high mud walls, manned by thousands of Egba warriors who were often armed with their own European muskets supplied by British abolitionists who saw Abeokuta as a key ally against Dahomey. The Dahomey army, with the Agojie often forming the spearhead, launched two major ill-fated attacks on Abeokuta. The first, and most famous, occurred in 1851. Imagine the approach. The Dahomeyan army, tens of thousands strong, marched for days. The Nanomitten were at the front, their disciplined ranks contrasting with the dense, chaotic lines of the male militia. As they arrived, they were confronted not just by the walls, but by a chilling sight. British missionaries and Egba defenders flying the Union Jack, a clear signal that this was now an anti-slavery state backed by a foreign power. The attack was a disaster. The Agojie fought with their signature ferocity, charging the walls, attempting to scale the steep mud ramparts and cross the trenches under a hail of musket fire. They were experts in breaking down flimsy village walls, but these massive, professionally engineered defenses were something else entirely. They used axes and sheer force to try and hack their way through the massive gates. You can hear the deafening sound of Egba muskets firing in coordinated volleys from the ramparts, a tactic learned from their European allies. The Nanomitten suffered horrific casualties. The Egba defenders, knowing that the female warriors were the true heart of the Dahomey fighting force, focused their fire on them. Accounts from survivors speak of the Agojie climbing on top of the bodies of their fallen comrades to try and reach the top of the walls. Demonstrating that fanatical disregard for life we discussed earlier, remember the crocodile pit? A quirky tidbit that demonstrates the Egba's respect for the Agojie is the practice of capturing certain women alive for interrogation, while the male casualties were often decapitated after the battle. The captured Nanomitten were sometimes treated differently, seen as valuable intelligence and trophies. Many refused to talk and chose starvation or suicide over revealing information. But their capture was seen as a major propaganda victory for Abeokuta. The Dahomey army was decisively routed, forced to retreat and trudge the long, humiliating march back to Abomey. The loss of life was staggering, particularly among the Agojie contingent, marking a major setback for King Gezo. This mainstream historical fact The defeat at Abeokuta demonstrated that even the world's most disciplined female army could not overcome superior fortifications and disciplined numerically powerful defenders armed with modern European firepower. A second, less successful attempt followed in 1864, under King Leo, Gezo's successor, which also ended in defeat and high casualties. These attacks were strategic mistakes that cost Dahomey a significant portion of its fighting elite. Historians still argue whether the 1851 assault on Abeokuta represented an inherent strategic flaw in Dahomey's military doctrine, favoring speed and shock over siege warfare, or if it was simply a matter of the Egba defenses being too advanced, and the warriors' training being focused too heavily on bush warfare against softer targets. Regardless, the two failed sieges forced Dahomey to temporarily rethink its expansionist goals and shift its focus toward coastal raids and maintaining its grip on the slave trade against less formidable opposition. You walk the retreat path now, the air heavy with dust and the silence of loss. The sun beats down on the long columns of the defeated army, a rare sight for a kingdom accustomed only to victory. The Nanamatan are battered but not broken. Their next move will not be a frontal assault, but a return to the dark. Silent tactics that made them famous, psychological warfare. The defeats at Abeokuta, remember the towering walls and trenches, were costly, but the Kingdom of Dahomey was nothing if not resilient and adaptive. They understood that warfare was not just about musket fire and machetes, it was fundamentally about breaking the enemy's will before the first shot was fired. You are now witnessing their ruthless mastery of psychological warfare and terror, a state-sponsored campaign designed to paralyze their neighbors with fear. The centerpiece of this terror was the annual customs, a series of grand public ceremonies held in Abumi, ostensibly to honor the royal ancestors and solidify the power of the king. These events, however, were also massive. Theatrical displays of Dahomey's martial might and, notoriously, involved large-scale human sacrifice. The Nanamatan played a central chilling role in these ceremonies. Imagine the scene in the capital. Thousands of warriors, both male and female, parade before the king. The high point of the terror, however, was the display of captives and the ritual executions. The Ahasi would march, not just with their weapons, but often carrying the preserved heads of high-value enemy officers taken during recent campaigns. These heads were sometimes displayed atop tall poles or carried as trophies, a practice that sent a shudder of fear through any observer, particularly those from rival states. The message was unmistakable. Surrender, or your fate will be this public and gruesome. This use of ritualistic display was a deliberate strategy. In West African societies, the body and the head were of profound spiritual significance. The public desecration of an enemy leader's remains was seen as utterly destroying their spirit and preventing their powerful ancestors from intervening. This targeted symbolic violence was arguably more effective than any musket volley. The Nanamatan also had a specific, terrifying ritual duty during these events. While the main sacrifices were handled by specialized palace functionaries, the female warriors were often tasked with presenting the most important war captives to the king before their execution. In some accounts, the warriors were said to have executed captives themselves, performing the act with a professional, cold detachment that amplified the horror. They were fulfilling their oath to the king and the war god, go remember their religious dedication, turning them into agents of divine retribution. A quirky tidbit that demonstrates the psychological finesse of the king is the use of the white man's head during the customs. A large doll or effigy shaped like a European figure would sometimes be carried in the procession and then ritualistically destroyed or sacrificed. This was propaganda aimed at his own people, assuring them that Dahomey was powerful enough to defy even the fearsome Europeans, who were constantly pressuring them to end the slave trade. The terror extended beyond the capital. When a raiding party of Agojie approached an enemy town, they often announced their presence by leaving a signature trail, a pile of mutilated enemy dead on the outskirts, or a deliberate display of their machete prowess by cutting down trees in a particular symbolic pattern. This was tactical fear-mongering. Many villages, knowing the reputation of the Nanamatan, simply abandoned their homes and fled into the bush upon hearing the approach of the warrior women's scout party, often resulting in bloodless captures for Dahomey. Historians still argue whether the extreme violence and ritual terror were primarily a spiritual necessity to appease the ancestors or a coldly rational policy tool designed to maximize Dahomey's economic gains by minimizing resistance and thus reducing their own military casualties. It was likely a mutually reinforcing system. The spiritual justification fueled the terror, and the terror maximized the profits from the slave trade. You now understand that the greatest weapon of the Dahomey warriors was not the Danish musket nor the razor machete, but their reputation, a reputation meticulously curated by the king and ruthlessly maintained by the non-mitten through acts of calculated, terrifying violence. This reputation was the iron fist that secured their grip on the slave coast. You have seen the terror they inspired. Now you must understand the grim reality of their most central function. The psychological warfare and military discipline of the unmitten were entirely geared toward making the Kingdom of Dahomey the unchallenged. Center of the trade in human beings on the West African coast, you are now positioned on the infamous stretch of coastline known as the Slave Coast's Iron Fist, witnessing the warrior's role in the cruel economic engine of the Atlantic slave trade. Dahomey's power was inextricably linked to this trade. The kingdom wasn't just a supplier. It was a monopolist, controlling the crucial trade routes that channeled captives from the interior to the European forts at ports like Ouidah. The Agojie were the king's personal, most reliable instrument for maintaining this control. Their campaigns, remember the raids against the Yoruba, were primarily revenue generation expeditions. Imagine you are at the outskirts of Ouidah, the main port. The atmosphere is feverish, the smell of salt and tar mixes with the pervasive scent of human suffering. European traders, mostly Portuguese, French, and later Spanish, are waiting with bolts of cloth. Cowrie shells, the currency of the realm, iron bars, and the ever-essential European firearms. The non-mitten arrive, not as ceremonial guards, but as the grim collectors of the king's tribute. Their role was twofold: capture and security. Capture. The warriors were the most effective raiding force in the region. They specialized in the swift, silent ambush, designed to maximize the number of captives while minimizing the number of enemy defenders killed. They sought to secure whole towns or villages, marching the subdued population back to Abumi. The efficiency of the non-mitten in this grim task ensured a steady, predictable supply chain that European traders depended upon. Security. Once the captives were in Dahomey's hands, the Agojie often served as the elite security detail protecting the royal stockades and the slave routes from Abumi to the coast. They were utterly incorruptible and fiercely loyal to the king. A male guard might be bribed or convinced to release a captive. A non-mitten, whose entire status in life was tied to the king's will, would not. You see a column of captives being marched down the road, their necks linked by wooden yokes. The Agojie are flanking the column, their muskets held ready. Their reputation is enough to deter almost any attempt at escape or ambush by enemy forces attempting to reclaim their people. The silence and lethal professionalism of the female warriors are a far more effective deterrent than any traditional guard. A quirky tidbit that reveals the political complexity of the trade is that the Dahomey kings, under pressure from European abolitionists, especially the British, who patrolled the coast, would sometimes stage elaborate displays. In the 1840s and 50s, Guerrilla would agree to a treaty to limit the slave trade, but simultaneously the Agojie would be deployed inland to step up their raiding efforts, ensuring the flow of human cargo continued unabated through secondary ports. It was a calculated two-fist diplomacy. Historians still argue whether Dahomey was primarily driven by economic necessity, selling captives to buy guns to survive, or if there was a deeper culturally entrenched desire for conquest and the traditional use of captives in domestic servitude and ritual sacrifice. It's clear that by the mid-19th century, the system was so entrenched that to stop the raids would have meant the collapse of the state, and the Agojie were the key players ensuring that didn't happen. Their success in this role made them both rich and infamous. The European traders knew that the women soldiers were the guarantors of the trade. They were the visible sign of Dahomey's iron will and its commitment to the profitable, brutal commerce. The next stage of their history will be marked by the inevitable culture clash encounters between these African warriors and the European observers who came to witness them. As the Agojie secured Dahomey's position as the iron fist of the slave coast, remember the gruesome marches to Ouidah. Their reputation began to spread far beyond West Africa, carried back by the very Europeans who profited from, or fought against, the slave trade. You are now reading the astonished and often highly biased European encounters in fear of the Dahomey warrior women. European visitors to Abomey, whether missionaries, abolitionists, or professional traders, were almost universally stunned by the sight of this female army. In the rigidly gender-defined societies of 19th century Europe, the concept of a state relying on thousands of professionally trained, battle-hardened women soldiers was almost incomprehensible. Their initial accounts, often published in breathless detail, ranged from disbelief to profound, genuine respect and palpable fear. One of the most famous early accounts came from the British explorer and abolitionist William Wynyatt, who visited Abomey in the 1840s. He described them as neat and compact, and noted their military discipline was very astonishing. Crucially, he observed their military exercises, which often involved mock battles where the women displayed incredible agility, silent movements through the scrub, and a fearsome war yell that supposedly chilled the blood. Another widely quoted source is the account of Sir Richard Francis Burton, the famous Victorian explorer who visited Dahomey in 1864 as a British envoy. Burton, ever the pragmatic observer, dismissed the common European tendency to see them as Amazons, a Greek myth term, but conceded that they were unquestionably the elite of the Dahomeyan army. He meticulously detailed their different regiments and noted their manly appearance and bearing. A backhanded compliment that revealed the European bias that could only be great warriors if they somehow shed their femininity. The fear they inspired was not merely theoretical. European military observers were genuinely concerned about their fanatical zeal and disregard for death. The Agojie did not fight in the manner of European troops, who often retreated when casualties mounted. The warrior women were trained to fight until killed or captured, making them terrifyingly unpredictable adversaries. Traders on the coast knew that if they crossed the king, it would be these women, not the less disciplined male militia, who would come for their heads. A quirky tidbit from the European accounts is the emphasis placed on their apparent lack of beauty by some observers, particularly Burton. This was likely an attempt to rationalize their military effectiveness. If they were not traditionally feminine, then they could be great warriors. This perspective ignores the fact that in Dahomey society, their status and discipline defined a form of beauty and prestige that superseded conventional standards. Their scars were symbols of honor, not defects. The European governments, particularly Britain, began to take the Agojie seriously as a strategic challenge. The warriors were the direct instrument of the king's resistance to abolition efforts. The fact that the most effective, unyielding part of the Dahomey army was female added a bizarre, unsettling layer to the diplomatic and military confrontation. The British saw the warriors as a symbol of Dahomey's savage, unreformable nature. Historians still argue whether the European chroniclers consciously exaggerated the warrior women's ferocity and their role in the ceremonies, remember the crocodile dung sunscreen and other colorful details, to justify British military intervention and colonial expansion, or if the reports were a relatively objective description of a genuinely astonishing military force. What is certain is that the Agojie became a staple of Victorian imagination, the ultimate symbol of the powerful, yet terrifyingly alien, African other. You feel the weight of this cultural clash. These women, trained in the dense, silent bush, were about to unleash their highly specialized methods of combat against the conventional European military doctrine. Forcing a confrontation between two entirely different worlds of warfare, their unique edge lay in the art of the ambush, a tactic the Europeans simply had no frame of reference for. You have read the fear in the European accounts. Now you must understand the methods that justify that fear. When the Agojie operated outside of frontal assaults, like the disaster at Abeokuta, remember that bloody siege? They were nearly invincible. Their specialty lay in guerrilla tactics and battlefield mastery over the dense West African terrain, methods that bewildered their European-trained opponents. The Dahomey warriors didn't fight European-style line battles unless forced. Their primary tactical goal was not to win a prolonged exchange of fire, but to achieve total surprise and maximum disorientation. They were masters of the lightning strike, relying on their rigorous training in movement and silence. Remember their ability to move through thorns without a complaint. Imagine a company of male soldiers, whether Igba, Yoruba, or eventually French, marching cautiously through the thick, humid forest. They are loud, carrying heavy gear, and relying on open sight. The Nanamatan, by contrast, are moving parallel to them. Concealed just yards away in the undergrowth, often barefoot, their bodies covered in camouflaging dust or mud, they utilized the dense bush as a weapon. Their key tactical elements were silent infiltration. They would move into position without a sound, often flanking the enemy force completely unnoticed. They could lie in wait for hours, blending seamlessly into the environment, relying on their extreme discipline to remain motionless despite heat, insects, or exhaustion. The shock ambush: once the enemy was fully committed to a narrow path or a difficult crossing, the ambush would be sprung. It was often a sudden, coordinated volley of musket fire from multiple concealed positions, followed immediately by a terrifying, silent, and swift charge with their razor-edged machetes. Decisive close combat: the Agojie excelled in hand-to-hand combat. Their method was not attrition but the total destruction of the enemy's command and control. They would prioritize killing enemy officers and standard-bearers. Once the enemy lost its leadership and its rallying point, the flag panic often ensued, leading to a rout. Rapid extraction: the attack was designed to be over in minutes. Once the enemy broke, the warriors would secure their captives and retreat back into the bush, vanishing as quickly as they appeared, leaving the surviving enemy soldiers bewildered and terrified by the ghostly nature of the attack. A quirky tidbit that emphasizes their skill is their use of noise as a feint. While moving silently was key, they often employed a small vanguard of warriors whose only job was to make a huge racket, beating drums, blowing horns, and yelling to draw the enemy's attention toward a thicket, only for the main body of the Agojie to attack from a completely opposite silent flank. They weaponized distraction. This type of fighting was perfectly suited to the terrain. European military doctrine relied on formations, clear lines of fire, and heavy artillery, all things that were useless in the dense West African rainforest. The Agojie effectively nullified the technological advantage of firearms by closing the distance instantly and turning the encounter into a brutal, Makata-dominated brawl. Historians still argue whether the Agojie developed their sophisticated guerrilla tactics inherently through generations of hunting in the West African bush, or if the king's military advisors formally adopted and refined these tactics specifically to counter the growing threat of European trend forces and their locally organized allies. It's likely that traditional hunting skills were formalized into a state-level military doctrine. You are witnessing a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare. The enemy troops are left shooting at ghosts and struggling to defend themselves against opponents who seem to appear from the very earth and disappear just as fast. This tactical advantage would prove incredibly difficult for the French to counter when they finally arrived. We've established the ferocity and the guerrilla methods. Remember the silent infiltrations and the swift machete charges? Now we must understand why these tactics were so effective against their most technologically advanced enemies. You are observing a frustrating military problem, decoding the undecodable tactics employed by the Nanamatan that utterly baffled European military observers. The core issue lay in the fundamental difference between European and Dahomeyan military philosophy. European armies of the 19th century were built on the principles of massed firepower, logistics, and clear command and control structures. They expected to fight on open ground, in clear lines, exchanging volley fire. The Agojie did the exact opposite. They deliberately chose to fight in the most unfavorable terrain for European forces: the dense, humid forest, the thorny scrub, and the narrow, winding paths. This environmental mastery nullified the European advantage in artillery and long-range firepower. The musket fire of the French and the early Igba forces was often wasted, shooting at movement they couldn't clearly see or figures that melted back into the shadows. One crucial undecoded element was their lack of reliance on logistics. European forces required huge, slow-moving supply columns of food, water, and ammunition. This made them predictable and vulnerable. The Agojie, trained in privation, remember their endurance training, could live off the land or carry just enough supplies for a rapid several-day raid. They traveled lighter, moved faster, and could strike deep behind enemy lines with relative impunity. A French column might take a week to cover a distance the Nanamatan covered in 3 days. Furthermore, the Dahomey tactics capitalized on European cultural bias. The European officers saw an army of women, which often led them to underestimate the professionalism and strategic capability of the force. They simply couldn't conceive of a non-Western army executing complex, coordinated maneuvers without European-style mapping and communication. They dismissed the Agojie as savage warriors rather than highly trained professionals, which compounded their inability to predict their movements. A quirky tidbit that demonstrates this tactical puzzle is the Nananmatan's use of disguise. There are reports of warriors stripping down to appear like local female civilians, carrying water pots or wood, passing through enemy lines unnoticed, and then re-equipping their weapons for an internal ambush or reconnaissance mission. This ability to weaponize their gender and civilian appearance was a layer of stealth that European forces were completely unprepared for. The other major factor was the Dahomeyan approach to commandant control in chaos. When a French line was broken, their chain of command often disintegrated, relying on individual initiative to reform. When the Agojie were broken, they were trained to instantly scatter and regroup at a pre-designated point deep in the bush, coordinated by a series of precise nonverbal signals, often distinct bird calls or drum taps, that sounded like background noise to the untrained ear. Historians still argue whether the French military deliberately chose to ignore or downplay the sophisticated nature of the Agojie tactics. In their official reports, to avoid admitting that a primitive African force had repeatedly outperformed them in tactical maneuverability, what is certain is that the European military response was often too slow, too rigid, and too reliant on open-field warfare to effectively counter the lightning-fast, highly dispersed hit-and-run attacks of the warrior women. This tactical mastery gave Dahomey a prolonged lifespan, even as the external pressures of abolition and colonialism began to mount, pressures that were about to become too intense to ignore. The genius of Dahomey's guerrilla tactics remember how they weaponized the dense bush, bought them time, but the world was changing rapidly. You are now observing the mounting international outcry and British pressure to end the Kingdom of Dahomey's primary source of wealth, the slave trade. This pressure was the beginning of the end of the Dahomeyan way of life. By the mid-19th century, Great Britain had fully committed its considerable naval power, the Royal Navy, to suppressing the transatlantic slave trade. The Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron patrolled the coastline relentlessly, intercepting slave ships, leading to a massive increase in the risk and cost of the trade. Dahomey, as the major supplier on the slave coast, became the primary target of British diplomacy and military threats. The pressure wasn't just naval, it was diplomatic. The British sent multiple envoys to Abeokuta, including figures like Sir Richard Burton, who we met earlier, with the explicit goal of persuading or coercing King Agojie and later King Guerrilla to sign treaties abolishing the slave trade. You can imagine the scene in the palace, a stiff-coolered European diplomat, sweating under the tropical sun, trying to negotiate with a powerful, pragmatic African king, surrounded by thousands of silent, fiercely loyal warrior women. King Agojie was a master of evasion. He would acknowledge the British concern and even stage symbolic displays of destroying slave chains or signing non-committal documents. However, he always returned to the fundamental reality. Dahomey's treasury was filled by selling captives. He famously told a British envoy that the slave trade is the ruling principle of my people. It is the source of their glory and their wealth. He could not simply abolish it without fundamentally collapsing the state's military and economic apparatus. This is where the Agojie played a critical, defiant role. They were the visible, unyielding force ensuring that the king's will and the flow of slaves continued. When British gunboats blockaded the main port of Ouidah, the warrior women would be deployed to secure alternate, smaller creeks and beaches, ensuring that the captives reached the waiting ships. They were the king's defiance in the face of European moral and military power. A quirky tidbit that illustrates the depth of the abolitionist conflict is the British sponsorship of Abeokuta. Remember the heavily fortified city they couldn't conquer? The British saw Abeokuta as a Christian, anti-slavery counterweight to Dahomey's brutal pagan kingdom. This meant that every time the Agojie went to war with the Igba, they were indirectly fighting the military and financial influence of the world's greatest superpower. As the legitimate slave trade dwindled, Dahomey tried to transition to commodities like palm oil as mentioned previously, but the raids for captives continued. The king needed the labor for the oil plantations, and he still needed the display of martial power that constant raiding provided. The Agojie thus remained essential for both economic gain and political stability. Historians still argue whether the British pressure was genuinely driven by humanitarian abolitionist ideals. or if it was also motivated by a desire to gain economic advantage by disrupting the trade monopoly of Dahomey and opening the region up to British legitimate commerce like palm oil on their own terms. It was likely a complex mix of morality and commercial self-interest. You feel the historical clock ticking. The pressure is becoming unbearable. The British blockade has weakened the kingdom. And though the Agojie remain undefeated by European ground forces, they are draining Dahomey's wealth and manpower. The inevitable confrontation, however, would not come from the seafaring British, but from a different European power marching from the land, the French. The relentless British pressure, remember the naval blockades and the push for palm oil, had weakened Dahomey, but it was the arrival of a new, ambitious colonial power that sealed the kingdom's fate. You are now witnessing the inevitable tension created by the French colonial advance, setting the stage for the dramatic clash between the Agojie's disciplined but traditional methods and modern European military technology. By the late 19th century, the scramble for Africa was in full swing. France viewed the territory surrounding Dahomey as crucial to establishing its dominance in West Africa, linking its coastal settlements with its vast holdings inland. They had established a protectorate in Porto Novo, Dahomey's traditional rival, and were steadily encroaching on Dahomeyan territory. The reigning monarch, King Behanzin, who took the throne in 1889, was a different man than his predecessors. He was fiercely independent, charismatic, and educated, keenly aware of the European threat. He knew that signing a treaty with the French was simply a prelude to losing his entire kingdom. His strategy was clear: resist by force, using the army built by his ancestors, centered around the elite Nananmatan. The military reality was stark. The French forces were equipped with the latest military technology of the era. Their infantry carried breech-loading rifles, like the Lebel or Grass models, which were infinitely superior to the Agojie's single-shot, muzzle-loading Danish flintlocks. Remember those? The breech-loaders could be reloaded and fired many times faster, giving the French a devastating rate of fire advantage. More crucially, the French possessed artillery and machine guns, weapons of mass destruction that Dahomey had no effective counter against. King Behanzin did attempt to modernize. He desperately tried to purchase breech-loading rifles and even small artillery pieces through various channels, paying for them with the remaining profits from palm oil and, yes still, the slave trade. But these weapons were often outdated, and the supply was erratic and limited compared to the massive arsenal available to the French. The Agojie represented the king's moral and military backbone. He knew that the male army, made up largely of conscripts and local levies, might waver when faced with European firepower. But the Nananmatan, with their fanatic loyalty and disregard for death, were his shock troops, the ultimate expression of Dahomeyan sovereignty. They were the ones he would rely on for the desperate fight. A quirky tidbit that demonstrates Behanzin's defiance is his systematic rejection of French diplomatic gifts. He saw the French overtures as insults and often treated their envoys with barely concealed hostility. The French, for their part, were outraged and fueled the narrative in Europe that Dahomey was an intractable and barbaric kingdom, needing to be subdued for the good of civilization. The inevitable flashpoint came over the right to control certain coastal villages and collect customs duties. Skirmishes escalated into full-blown military action in 1890, marking the beginning of the end. Historians still argue whether King Behanzin should have adopted a more conciliatory approach with the French to buy more time for military modernization, or if his defiance was the only path consistent with Dahomeya's history of military self-reliance and honor. You can hear the French troops now singing their marching songs as they approach the coast. They are confident, armed with superior technology, and utterly convinced of their own racial and military superiority. They have no idea of the horror that awaits them in the dense bush, where the Nananmatan will unleash their decades of guerrilla mastery in a final bloody resistance. The First War is about to begin. The tension erupts into the First Franco-Dahomeyan War in 1890. King Behanzin's defiance, remember his refusal of the French gifts, has led to the inevitable. The French, under Colonel Terrelon, attempt to secure the Porto Novo border. But they quickly discover that fighting the Agojie in the bush is a completely different proposition from fighting colonial opponents in open terrain. The war began with surprising early victories for the Dahomey forces, proving that superior organization and guerrilla mastery could, at times, overcome a massive technological deficit. You are now positioned near the Battle of Katana, a key coastal skirmish that shocked the French command. The non-mitten were deployed immediately. Their role was classic guerrilla warfare, swift, terrifying ambushes designed to break the morale of the advancing French troops. French soldiers, expecting an easy conquest, were instead subjected to relentless psychological warfare and physical trauma. Imagine a French column marching slowly, relying on their breech-loading rifles for protection. Suddenly, the forest explodes, not with continuous fire, but with a sudden coordinated volley from concealed positions, immediately followed by the terrifying sight of the warrior women charging silently with their razor-sharp machetes. The French, used to the relative order of European battlefields, panicked in the face of this suicidal ferocity. A core fact from this war is the Battle of Katana, 1890. The Dahomey forces, including a significant contingent of Agojie, launched a desperate night attack on the French-held customs house. Although the French eventually held the position, the fighting was brutal, hand-to-hand, and extended. The Agojie demonstrated incredible courage, charging directly into machine gun fire and artillery range with the goal of reaching the enemy lines. Their disregard for death was so profound that it utterly unnerved the French soldiers, many of whom had never encountered a foe who refused to surrender or retreat. The Dahomey victory wasn't in holding ground. It was in inflicting disproportionate casualties and damaging French morale. The non-mitten were masters of the hitandrin. They would strike hard, drag any wounded French soldiers back into the bush to prevent their recovery, and melt away before French reinforcements could arrive. The terrain, which they knew intimately, was their greatest ally. Remember their silent tracking skills from training. A quirky tidbit that spread through the French ranks was the women's habit of mutilating the bodies of French officers they managed to kill. This was done partly for ritualistic reasons to secure the power of the enemy spirit. But it also served the psychological purpose of terrifying the surviving French troops who became deeply concerned about being captured or killed by the Agojie. The First War ultimately ended in a truce, not a decisive French victory. The French, battered and surprised by the tenacity and skill of the Dahomeyan army, particularly the female corps, were forced to temporarily recognize the independence of Dahomey and withdraw from certain territories. They had won the skirmishes, but they hadn't won the war. Historians still argue whether the French failure to achieve a quick victory in 1890 was primarily due to the tactical genius of the Dahomeyan defense led by the Agojie, or simply a matter of French military underestimation and a lack of adequate troops for a full-scale invasion at that time. Regardless, the Agojie had proved they were a match for a modern European army in the specific context of West African bush warfare. This reprieve, however, was temporary. The French were humiliated, and they would return 2 years later, this time with overwhelming force and a clear directive: total conquest. King Behanzin would soon face his final, tragic stand. The truce of 1890 was merely a pause. King Behanzin, remember his fiercely independent spirit, used the brief respite to redouble his efforts, knowing that the French would return with a vengeance. You are now observing the heartbreaking final preparations, Behanzin's final stand, a desperate attempt to modernize his army and strategically deploy the ferocious Agojie against the overwhelming tide of French firepower. Behanzin understood that the guerrilla ambushes, while effective for harassment, could not win a full-scale war. He attempted to transition his army from a raiding force into one capable of engaging in semi-conventional warfare. He used the limited funds available to purchase more modern weapons, often buying breech-loading rifles piece by piece from German and Portuguese traders, circumventing the French blockade. He even tried to recruit mercenary artillery experts to train his men, though with little long-term success. Despite these efforts, the core of his defense remained the net. Behanzin knew that their fanatic loyalty and extreme courage were his most reliable assets. He placed the Agojie in the most critical positions, primarily as the shock troops and the last line of defense. In the Second Franco-Dahomeyan War, 1892, they were deployed not just for ambushes, but often positioned in the center, or on the flanks of the main battle lines, tasked with absorbing the first wave of fire and then counterattacking with maximum ferocity. You see the parade grounds now. The warriors are drilling, but their muskets, the old Danish flintlocks, look antiquated next to the few shining modern French rifles they have captured. The king reviews his troops, his face grim but resolute. He is relying not on technology, but on the human factor, the unyielding will of his elite corps. The French under General Alfred Dodds returned in 1892 with a force of over 4,000 highly disciplined Senegalese, tirailleurs, African colonial troops, and foreign legion, all armed with the latest repeating rifles, and crucially, a sizable complement of heavy artillery and machine guns. This time, they came prepared for the bush. They cut wide paths through the scrub to deny the Dahomey warriors the cover they relied on and used their superior logistics to maintain a steady advance. A crucial strategic point of Behanzin's deployment was using the Agojie to hold critical choke points in rivers, forcing the French to halt and engage in frontal assaults where the terrain mitigated the effectiveness of their long-range artillery. He was attempting to recreate the scenario of a close-quarters fight. Remember, the machetes are best in close quarters, where the women's ferocity could carry the day. A quirky tidbit is the recorded instance of King Behanzin attempting to employ spiritual countermeasures. During the initial battles, he commissioned ritual leaders to craft powerful charms, or bow, designed to neutralize the effectiveness of the French rifles and machine guns. He genuinely believed that the French technology was protected by powerful foreign spirits, and that his Agojie, protected by the Dahomeyan war god Go, could pierce that spiritual armor. Historians still argue whether the Agojie were strategically wasted by being deployed in open battle lines during the 1892 campaign, or if the king had no other choice, as the male army's morale was too brittle to face the sustained fire of the French colonial machine. What is certain is that the non-mitten fought with a courage that stunned even the hardened veterans of the Foreign Legion, creating legends that would be carried back to Europe. The stage is set for the final, bloody showdown along the Weem River. The warriors are ready, their oaths sworn, their fear forgotten. The fight is no longer for territory or captives. It is for the very existence of the Kingdom of Dahomey. The French offensive in 1892, under General Dodds, was relentless, driving inland toward Dahomey. You are now witnessing the climax of the conflict, the most decisive and bloody engagement of the Second Franco-Dahomeyan War, the Battle of Dogba. This was the moment where the sheer ferocity of the Agojie met the overwhelming lethality of modern European technology. The Battle of Dogba, fought in September 1892, was not a single, isolated engagement, but a series of desperate encounters along the path to the capital. The French forces were advancing slowly but inexorably, clearing the bush as they went. King Behanzin made the fateful decision to deploy his elite forces, the Nenomitinen, a massive, coordinated attack designed to break the French line and force a rout, much as they had done against their regional rivals for decades. Imagine the French position, a heavily defended encampment, protected by machine guns, the infamous Nordenfeldt gun, and sustained artillery fire. The French troops, hardened colonial veterans, were no longer surprised by the tactics of the Dahomey army. They were waiting, the Agojie charged. Accounts from French officers later described the scene with a mixture of terror and awe. The warrior women came in waves, letting loose their terrifying war cries, their objective being to close the distance instantly to negate the French firepower advantage. They were armed with their razor machetes and their old flintlocks, rushing headlong into a storm of lead. The result was a slaughter. The French breech-loading rifles, capable of firing multiple rounds per minute, and the continuous rattle of the machine guns, cut down the charging lines with horrific efficiency. Where a musket volley might take out a few dozen men, a machine gun could fell hundreds in minutes. The women's traditional guerrilla tactics, based on swift ambushes and close-quarters shock, remember their mastery of the bush, were ineffective against a Dujin, technologically superior enemy prepared for the fight. Despite the carnage, the Agojie did not break. Their fanatical commitment, the product of years of training and psychological conditioning, meant they fought to the very last. French reports note that the women often continued to fight, even after suffering multiple bullet wounds, using their machetes in a final desperate attempt to strike a French soldier before falling. The French were forced to fight hand-to-hand, a grim testament to the warriors' success in closing the distance. A crucial fact about the aftermath of Dogba: the casualties for Dahomey were staggering, decimating the ranks of the Agojie. The French, while suffering losses, maintained their line. The battle broke the military backbone of the kingdom. King Behanzin lost the most capable, dedicated, and irreplaceable portion of his army. A quirky tidbit that demonstrates the psychological strain on the French. After the battle, French soldiers were reportedly so unnerved by the women's ferocity that they debated whether the Agojie should be treated as legitimate prisoners of war or as fanatics to be summarily executed. General Dodds himself had to issue specific orders regarding the respectful handling of the dead. Historians still argue whether the high casualty rate of the Agojie at Dogba was a result of the king deliberately sacrificing them as a final, desperate act of morale for the remaining army, or if it was simply the inevitable consequence of pitting 17th-century weaponry and tactics against 19th-century industrialized military technology. Regardless of the intent, the consequence was the same. The corps was virtually annihilated as an effective fighting force. With the core of his army destroyed, Behanzin's defense crumbled. The French marched on Abomey, occupying the capital in November 1892. The warriors' desperate courage could not save the kingdom from the march of colonial history. The carnage at Dogba, you recall the machine guns meeting the machetes, marked the military end of the Kingdom of Dahomey. You are now witnessing the grim aftermath, the tragic end of the corps. Following the French occupation of Abomey in late 1892 and the subsequent political decisions regarding the surviving female warriors, King Behanzin initially refused to surrender, resorting to a final desperate guerrilla campaign in the bush. The remaining Agojie, though few in number and grievously wounded, formed the core of his final personal guard and fighting force. They continued to execute lightning ambushes, their specialty, remember, against French patrols, keeping the occupation forces on edge well into 1893. However, without a central logistical base and facing overwhelming French numbers, this resistance was unsustainable. In January 1894, Behanzin finally surrendered to the French, marking the official end of the independent Kingdom of Dahomey. The fate of the surviving Nenamitin was immediately decided by the victorious French colonial administration. The French had a difficult dilemma. They had been profoundly impressed and equally horrified by the warriors' courage. They recognized that these women were not ordinary combatants but an elite, royal institution, the very symbol of Dahomey's defiance. Allowing them to remain organized would risk future rebellion. Simply executing them would create martyrs and perhaps provoke a larger uprising. The decision was made to disband the corps completely and formally. The women were systematically stripped of their privileged status, their uniforms, and their weapons. They were essentially demilitarized. For women who had known nothing but the extreme status and rigid discipline of palace life since childhood, remember their isolated existence as the king's wives. This demobilization was a form of profound psychological and social dislocation. The French offered the survivors three main paths, all leading away from their former lives. Exile, many of the highest-ranking officers, who were seen as potential leaders of resistance, were either imprisoned or sent into exile, along with King Behanzin himself. Forced integration. Some of the rank-and-file warriors were quietly allowed to return to their communities of origin. This was a brutal transition. They were trained to be celibate, lethal soldiers, and they were returning to a society where their warrior status was now meaningless under colonial rule. They were highly disciplined women with no conventional social function. Incorporation limited, a very small number of the younger, less politically influential warriors were, for a short time, incorporated into the French colonial structure, sometimes serving as palace servants or low-ranking guards for French administrators. This was a symbolic, cynical move designed to show the end of Dahomey's power. A quirky tidbit is the French practice of confiscating the personal war charms, or beaux, of the captured Agojie. The French officers would keep them as exotic trophies, often noting the strange ingredients, demonstrating that even after defeating them, the Europeans still sought to understand the spiritual power they believed protected the women on the battlefield. Remember Behanzin's attempt at spiritual countermeasures? Historians still argue whether the French decision to simply disband the corps instead of executing them en masse was a calculated act of colonial clemency designed to foster goodwill, or if it was a political maneuver to avoid creating a powerful resistance movement centered around the execution of the kingdom's greatest heroes. The result was the quiet, tragic disappearance of an entire military culture. The women, who had terrified a continent and defied a European power, simply faded back into civilian life, forever marked by the scars, both visible and invisible, of their extraordinary past. Their story, however, was not quite over. The official end of the Agojie Corps in 1894 left thousands of women adrift. Remember their forced demobilization. You are now attempting to trace the faint, fragmented historical records of post-war life and survivor stories, seeking to understand how these highly specialized warriors adapted to the colonial world. For the vast majority, the transition was painful. The women were trained to fight and govern, not to farm or marry. They had known extreme status, yet now they were merely civilian women under French rule. Lacking the protections and privileges of the king's wives, many were unable to integrate, choosing to live solitary lives forever bound by their oaths and memories. The historical record, dominated by French colonial reports, offers few detailed personal accounts from the survivors themselves. The French were more interested in erasing the legacy of defiance than recording individual stories of courage. However, one name stands out: a woman who bridged the terrifying age of Dahomeyan independence and the slow march of the 20th century. Nawi is widely considered to be the last known surviving Dahomey warrior. Born likely in the 1880s, she would have been a very young recruit during the Second Franco-Dahomeyan War in 1892. Remember the Battle of Dogba? She would have experienced the final brutal defeats firsthand. Her story offers a poignant link between the heroic past and the muted colonial present. You can picture Nawi decades later, living quietly in the village of Kinta, in the former Dahomey. She was interviewed by a Benin historian, Patrick R. Pognan, in the 1970s. By then, she was an elderly woman, blind and frail. But her memory of the war and her pride in being a Neno-Nemetan remained absolute. She recalled the discipline, the intense training, and the horror of the final battles against the French. A mainstream historical fact drawn from the study of survivors is that many of the Agojie never married or had children, upholding their ritual vows of celibacy even after the king who commanded it was gone. Their identity as king's wives remained paramount, a silent, lifelong commitment to the lost kingdom. For them, a conventional life would have been a betrayal of their comrades and their ancestors. A quirky tidbit that demonstrates the quiet defiance of the survivors is the discovery that some of the older warriors continued to gather secretly long after the war, meeting in the bush at night to recite the old battle chants and perform the military drills. Remember their rhythmic thud-thud-thud training sound, in order to keep the spirit of the Corps alive, away from the prying eyes of the French administration. Historians still argue whether the relative obscurity of the surviving warriors was due to intentional French suppression of their history, or if the warriors themselves chose silence and isolation as a means of preserving their honor and protecting themselves from a society that no longer understood their immense status. The quiet, long life of Nawi, the last warrior, stands as a powerful testament. She survived the end of her world and lived into the modern era, a living, breathing anachronism. She was the final faint echo of the era when an African queen ruled an army of women so fierce they terrified the agents of colonialism. Her eventual death marked the physical end of the Neno-Nemetan, but their spiritual and cultural legacy was just beginning to re-emerge. The silent passing of the last survivors, like Nawi, remember her interview in the 1970s, did not mean the death of the warrior women's story. You are now observing the powerful re-emergence of their cultural legacy and modern echoes in the Republic of Benin, the modern nation that occupies the territory of the former Dahomey. In the immediate aftermath of the French conquest and through much of the colonial period, the Agojie narrative was suppressed. The French promoted their own colonial history, framing the defeat of Dahomey as a necessary step for civilization. The memory of the fierce, defiant women warriors was deemed inconvenient and potentially rebellious. However, after Benin gained independence in 1960, the narrative began to shift. The Neno-Nemetan were no longer viewed as savage opponents, but as powerful, indigenous symbols of resistance against colonialism, and as a source of immense national pride. They became an essential element of Benin's national identity, representing female strength and the spirit of refusal to bow to overwhelming power. You can see this legacy in the modern cultural landscape. The stories of the warrior women are now proudly taught in schools. Statues and memorials commemorating their courage have been erected in Abomey and Katana, often depicting them with their signature machetes and muskets. They are celebrated as national heroes. A mainstream historical fact is the significant role the historical record of the Agojie has played in modern African feminist discourse. Their story provides a powerful, tangible counterpoint to the common narrative that leadership and military power were exclusively male domains in traditional African societies. They are often held up as an early, if brutal, example of gender equality achieved through military utility. A quirky tidbit that demonstrates the popular appeal of their legend is their frequent appearance in popular African media, including films, comics, and literature, where they are often portrayed in highly romanticized, almost mythological terms, the ultimate female fighters. While this sometimes sacrifices historical accuracy for drama, it speaks to the enduring power of their image as uncompromising defenders of their land. The cultural impact extends to the military itself. The idea of female martial prowess is celebrated. While a direct descendant of the Ahasi Corps does not exist, the willingness of the former kingdom's people to accept and elevate women to roles of extreme power remains an important part of the national psyche. Historians still argue whether the modern interpretation of the Agojie as purely anti-colonial heroes overlooks or minimizes their primary historical function as the military instrument of a brutal slave-trading state. Remember their role as the slave coast's iron fist, or, if it is a necessary, modern act of reclamation, to celebrate their unparalleled courage regardless of the political context of the 19th century. You realize that history is constantly being rewritten, not by changing facts, but by changing focus. The Dahomey warrior women were, in their time, terrifying agents of a cruel state. But in the modern context, they have been transformed into powerful symbols of defiant, undeniable female strength, ensuring that their names will not be forgotten. The next step is understanding why they were hidden for so long. We've seen the powerful cultural reclamation in modern Benin. Remember the statues and national pride? Yet, for much of the 20th century, the Dahomey warrior women remained a mere footnote or an exoticized myth in mainstream Western education. You are now investigating the hidden histories unveiling, exploring the reasons for their relative obscurity and the recent efforts to correct this narrative omission. The primary reason for their historical marginalization lies in the biases of the two dominant historical sources. The colonial narrative. The French, having conquered Dahomey after a protracted and bloody war, had a vested interest in minimizing the skill and competence of their opponents. To admit that they struggled for years against an army led by women would undermine the narrative of European military and racial superiority necessary to justify the colonial project. They preferred to portray the Agojie as barbaric savages rather than professional soldiers, effectively sweeping their tactical achievements, remember the guerrilla tactics that baffled the French, under the rug. The abolitionist narrative, paradoxically, early English language histories also tended to obscure the warriors. Abolitionists focused on Dahomey as a monstrous, evil slave-trading kingdom. And while the Agojie were mentioned as symbols of its cruelty, there was no appetite to celebrate them as military heroes. They were the agents of a great evil, and therefore, their professional competence was downplayed in favor of tales of brutality. Remember the sensationalized crocodile pit. For a long time, the only available primary sources were the often sensationalized and incomplete accounts of European visitors like Richard Burton. These accounts often focused on the spectacular, the executions, and the strange customs while failing to offer a serious, systematic analysis of the Army's training structure and tactical brilliance. Remember the detailed all-male command structure. The real work of unveiling this history began with post-colonial African historians in the mid to late 20th century. Scholars from Benin and the wider West African region began meticulously sifting through oral traditions, local court records, and reappraising the biased European documents. They aimed to recenter the narrative on Dahomey's sovereignty and the internal logic of the Agojie Corps, moving past the Western fascination with their gender. A crucial aspect of this unveiling is the realization that the Dahomey warriors were, in many ways, an example of a successful military-industrial state operating outside the European model. Their system-extreme training, absolute loyalty, and resource acquisition through war was hyper-rational, even if morally repugnant by today's standards. A quirky tidbit that demonstrates the narrative challenge is that, until quite recently, many Western textbooks and encyclopedias continued to refer to the Agojie as Amazons, perpetuating the Greek mythological term that denied them their true indigenous identity. Nonamatin, and reduced them to a fantastical curiosity. Historians still argue whether the contemporary popularity of the Dahomey warrior women-esque story, fueled in part by major films and media risks, turning them into one-dimensional superhero figures, overshadowing the harsh and complex realities of the 19th century Kingdom of Dahomey. Or if the increased attention is universally positive, as it forces a reassessment of Africa's powerful military past. You realize that every time this story is told accurately, free from the biases of the slave trade and colonialism, a piece of lost history is reclaimed. The warrior women of Dahomey were real, they were fierce, they were terrifyingly effective, and their tactics, decoded only too late by the French, cemented a powerful legacy that deserves its place not in myth, but in the serious annals of military history. We have traveled from the royal court of Abumi to the dusty, quiet life of the last survivor. Now remember her name? Now, you stand at the end of this long journey, ready to summarize the profound and often contradictory legacy of the Nanan myth. This final section focuses on a warrior's spirit endures, cementing their place as a singular testament to female power and resistance against overwhelming odds. The history of the Dahomey warrior women is a complex tapestry woven with threads of absolute brutality and astonishing courage. They were, without doubt, the agents of a state whose economy was built on the horrifying foundation of the slave trade. Remember the iron fist of the slave coast? Yet they were also one of the only all-male professional standing armies in world history, a testament to a society so pragmatic and focused on survival that it overturned conventional gender roles to achieve military dominance. Their story is a study in unbreakable discipline and extreme commitment. From the moment of their recruitment, often as children, through the grueling training, remember the psychological conditioning in the thorn pit, to their unwavering celibacy and loyalty to the king, they were forged into a weapon of total dedication. This commitment made them feared by their regional enemies and later utterly baffled and unnerved the French colonial forces. Their refusal to retreat, even in the face of machine gun fire, remember the carnage at Dogba, remains an indelible fact of military history. Their tactical brilliance was rooted in environmental mastery. Their guerrilla warfare, remember the silent ambushes and rapid extraction, was specifically designed to nullify the technological superiority of European armies in the West African bush. They proved that strategy, local knowledge, and an absolute will to fight could, for a time, hold the line against the industrial might of the 19th century. A mainstream historical fact that summarizes their legacy is that the Agojie successfully delayed the French conquest of Dahomey for decades longer than many other African states facing colonial powers. They were not merely a symbolic resistance, they were a materially effective force that forced the French to commit vast resources and suffer significant casualties before achieving victory. A quirky tidbit that encapsulates their unique status is the reported observation that French colonial troops, who later fought in other parts of Africa, would occasionally mistake any sight of female African civilians moving swiftly through the bush for the feared non-mitten, illustrating the long-lasting psychological imprint the warriors had made on the European military imagination. Historians still argue whether the enduring global interest in the Dahomey warriors is primarily because they were women in a field usually reserved for men, or if their military significance would be just as recognized. Had they been in all-male corps executing the same extraordinary feats of discipline and tactical genius? Ultimately, the warrior women of Dahomey stand as an enduring symbol of resistance, defiance, and extreme courage. They were the shield of a fading kingdom, fighting with unmatched ferocity for their status, their king, and their way of life, even when the odds were hopelessly stacked against them. Their story, once hidden, is now fully revealed, a powerful reminder that courage knows no gender, and that true terror lies not just in a weapon, but in the unyielding spirit behind it. The long journey to Abumi is concluding. The sound of the war drums has faded now, replaced by the soft evening sounds of the tropical landscape settling down for the night. You can let go of the images of the thorns, the sharp scent of the gunsmoke, and the relentless heat of the battlefield. The historical narrative of the Dahomey warriors, brutal and beautiful in its complexity, is complete. Take a deep, slow breath. The echoes of the machetes and the musket volleys are simply memories now, retreating back into the archives of time and dust. You are safe, far removed from the terror and the glory of that fiercely proud kingdom. The air is cooling, the tension is gone, and the long, quiet process of historical reflection has begun. You have witnessed a truly hidden story, a testament to the fact that power, even in the most rigid of worlds, can be channeled and wielded by those deemed least likely. Let that history settle gently, turning the violence of the past into the quiet contemplation of the present. Sleep well, and let the warrior women fade to rest.